Camille Beaumont hurled the rusty car key across the sunlit courtyard. It struck the fountain stone base, ricocheted twice, and clattered to a stop at the polished shoes of Dolores Whittaker, her late father's black maid, still in her gray uniform, still holding a folded linen napkin like she hadn't quite understood what was happening. 300 guests watched in silence. "Daddy always said you were part of the family," Camille said, her voice honey-sweet and loud enough to carry across the entire estate. "So here's your inheritance. Congratulations, sweetheart. You just became the proud owner of a piece of rolling garbage." Laughter rippled through the crowd like a wave breaking on marble. Dolores didn't move. She stared at the key on the ground, then at Camille, then at the 300 faces watching her the way people watch a car accident. "Go on, pick it up," Camille said, sipping her champagne. "Consider it your severance package. 22 years of scrubbing my father's toilets and now you get to drive off in a rust bucket. Isn't America wonderful?" More laughter, louder this time. Dolores bent down slowly. Her knees ached the way they always ached after 14-hour shifts. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the key. She stood up straight, looked Camille dead in the eyes for exactly 1 second, then turned and walked off the estate grounds without a word. She didn't look back. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Camille smirked, raised her glass to her friends, and never once suspected that the woman she just humiliated in front of Connecticut's wealthiest families had just walked away with the single most valuable object on the entire property. An object worth more than the mansion, more than the land, more than the entire Beaumont fortune combined. But before you shake your head at Camille Beaumont, before you decide this is just another story about a cruel rich girl, you need to understand something. You need to understand where Dolores Whittaker's hands learned their trade, because those weren't the hands of a maid. Not really. Those were the hands of a woman whose grandfather had once been the most sought-after coach builder in the American South, and whose knowledge Dolores had been carrying inside her head for 47 years like a loaded weapon nobody knew she owned. Dolores didn't go back to her apartment that night. She couldn't. She'd been paying rent on it out of a paycheck that Camille had cut in half 2 weeks earlier, and the eviction notice had arrived that morning, taped to her door in a pink envelope. Instead, she walked 6 miles along the shoulder of the Merritt Parkway, the rusty key still clenched in her fist, until she reached the auto salvage lot where her late husband's cousin, Marcus, ran a night shift. She sat down on an overturned milk crate behind the office, opened her canvas tote bag, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook so worn the corners had softened into velvet. The cover was stamped in faded gold letters: Whittaker and Sons, Coachwork and Restoration, Charleston, South Carolina. Est. 1938. She opened it to a page she had read 1,000 times but never once mentioned to anyone at the Beaumont estate. Not to Camille, not to the other staff. Not even to Bernard Beaumont himself in all 22 years she'd worked for him, though he was the only person who might have understood. Charleston, 1978. Dolores was 9 years old the first time her grandfather, Elijah Whittaker, let her hold a caliper. His workshop sat on a dirt road on the edge of the Ashley River, a converted tobacco barn with hand-hewn beams and a floor that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. He had built the business from nothing after returning from the Second World War with 2 Purple Hearts and a burning refusal to be told what he couldn't do. "You don't fix a car, Dolores," he would tell her, his voice as slow and deep as the river outside. "You listen to it. A machine is like a person. It carries everything that ever happened to it in its bones, and if you're quiet enough, it will tell you its whole life." By the time she was 12, Dolores could identify any pre-war European chassis by the shape of its firewall rivets. By 15, she had memorized every serial number sequence used by Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Bugatti, and Talbot Lego between 1930 and 1965. She knew factory paint codes by heart. She could read a hand-stamped chassis plate the way most girls her age read magazines. Elijah Whittaker used to say her mind was a museum with no walls. The workshop closed in 1994. Elijah Whittaker was 78 years old, and his hands, The same hands that had once rebuilt a Bugatti Type 57 for a Rockefeller heir could no longer hold a torque wrench without shaking. The bank foreclosed on the property in the spring. Developers bought the land, tore down the tobacco barn, and paved it into a strip mall parking lot within 8 months. Elijah watched from across the street the day the wrecking ball came. He didn't say a word. He just stood there in his old work coveralls, hands folded in front of him, and cried the silent kind of tears that don't move your face. 2 nights before he died, he gave Dolores the notebook. She was 24 then, working 2 jobs, saving for a community college degree she would never finish because her mother got sick and the money went where it needed to go. Elijah pressed the leather-bound book into her hands with fingers that felt like paper. Everything I ever learned is in this book, baby girl. Every formula, every measurement, every trick the Italians taught me at Sebring in 1959, every secret the Germans wouldn't share with anyone else. He squeezed her hand. The world's gonna try to make you small, Dolores. They're gonna look at you and see a nobody. But you carry this notebook and you carry what's in your head, and one day, something's gonna come along that nobody else can see. And when it does, you'll be ready. He died the following Tuesday. Heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful, the doctor said. Dolores kept the notebook. It followed her through every apartment, every job, every heartbreak. It sat in a shoebox under her bed while she worked as a hotel housekeeper in Atlanta. It sat in a duffel bag on top of her fridge while she cleaned offices in Baltimore. It sat in a canvas tote in the trunk of her Toyota when she drove north to Connecticut in 2002, chasing a job listing in a newspaper for domestic staff at a private estate in Greenwich. The estate belonged to Bernard Beaumont, 68 years old at the time, widowed twice, founder and majority shareholder of Beaumont Industrial Holdings, a shipping conglomerate worth roughly $4 billion. He interviewed her personally in his study, offered her the job on the spot, and shook her hand like she was a person and not a resume. For the first 15 years, Dolores was invisible. She scrubbed floors. She polished silver. She washed windows. She ironed shirts. She made beds. She smiled at Camille when Camille came home from boarding school and treated her like furniture. She smiled at Camille's boyfriends when they mistook her for the coat-check girl at Christmas parties. She smiled and smiled and smiled, and inside her head she cataloged license plates and serial numbers and paint codes the way other women cataloged grocery lists. Then, in the winter of 2017, Bernard fell off a stepladder in his private garage while trying to reach a shelf. Dolores was the only staff member in the wing. She heard the crash, ran in, and found him on the concrete floor with a broken wrist and a bruised ego. While she waited for the ambulance, she sat beside him on the cold cement, and to keep him talking, to keep him conscious, she looked around at his collection of 11 classic cars and started identifying them. That's a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, sir. Serial number should end in something between 3387 and 4675. Original color looks like Rosso Senna, but somebody repainted it. You can tell because the door jamb is a shade lighter than the fender. Bernard turned his head slowly and stared at her like she just started speaking Latin. That one over there, the silver one, that's a Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing 1955. The louvers on the hood tell me it's an early production model. And that one behind it, that's a 1957 Jaguar XKSS. Only 16 were ever built. Steve McQueen owned one. This one has the wrong wheels, though. Somebody put Dunlop knockoffs on it. Should have Borani wire wheels. Bernard didn't say a word until the ambulance arrived. But 2 days later, when he came home from the hospital with his arm in a cast, he asked Dolores to come sit with him in the garage. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, one for himself and one for her, and he said, "Dolores, who in God's name are you?" She told him about Elijah, about the Charleston workshop, about the notebook. She didn't show him the notebook, not yet, but she told him it existed. Bernard listened without interrupting for 2 hours. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, looked at his 11 cars, and said, "How much are you making cleaning my house?" She told him the number. Bernard shook his head slowly, took a long sip of his scotch, and said, "That's an insult, to you and to me both." He tripled her salary that week. He didn't change her title, didn't announce anything to Camille or the other staff, didn't even put it in writing at first. He just quietly rerouted the money through a separate account and told his accountant it was for consulting services. From that point forward, Bernard Beaumont and Dolores Whitaker met every Wednesday evening in the garage. He would pour 2 glasses of scotch and they would talk about cars for hours. He asked her about compression ratios. She answered. He asked her about the differences between Zagato and Pininfarina bodywork. She answered. He asked her about the 1955 Le Mans disaster and what really caused the Mercedes 300 SLR to launch into the crowd, and she gave him a technical explanation involving the interaction between the magnesium alloy body panels, the experimental air brake system, and the poorly designed spectator berm that no automotive historian she'd ever read had put together quite the way her grandfather had. Bernard began bringing her books to read, rare technical manuals, auction catalogs, personal letters from collectors he'd corresponded with over 4 decades. He never told Camille about any of it. He knew exactly what his daughter would say. Camille had been born into money and raised on the belief that certain people existed to serve her and certain people existed to be served by her, and the line between the two was drawn by skin and by circumstance and by nothing else. Bernard had spent 40 years trying to correct her worldview and had failed at every turn. So he kept his Wednesdays with Dolores private. It was, in a way, the last small rebellion of an old man who knew his daughter was going to inherit everything and undo every good thing he'd ever tried to build. Bernard died in the summer of 2023. Pancreatic cancer. It took him fast. 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Dolores was one of only 3 people who visited him in the hospital every day. The other 2 were his lawyer and his oncologist. Camille came twice, both times with a camera crew from a magazine profiling grieving heiresses, and both times she stayed less than 20 minutes before complaining about the smell. 2 days before he died, Bernard called Dolores to his bedside and pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. His fingers were cold. His eyes were clear. "There's a car in the back building, Dolores, behind the old carriage house. It's been under a tarp since 1979. I bought it at a private sale in Marseille and I never told anyone what it was. Not my wife, not my daughter, not my insurance company. I couldn't. If Camille ever found out, she'd sell it to some Russian oligarch before my body was cold." He squeezed her hand. "It's yours. I've put it in writing. Whatever happens after I'm gone, that car is yours. Don't let her take it from you." Dolores unfolded the paper. It was a chassis number, handwritten in Bernard's shaky script, and beneath it, one line. "You'll know what to do." She didn't have a chance to ask him what he meant. He slipped into a morphine sleep that afternoon and never fully woke up again. The funeral was on a Saturday. Camille wore black Chanel and cried on cue for the photographers. The reading of the will was on the following Monday. Dolores wasn't invited, but that didn't matter because within 72 hours, Camille had already begun her purge of the estate. The first thing to go was the household staff's dignity. Camille called an all-hands meeting on Tuesday morning in the grand foyer, and one by one she cut salaries. Dolores's cut was the deepest, 50%. Camille announced it in front of everyone with a smile so wide it looked painful. "Dolores, sweetheart, my father had you on some kind of consulting arrangement that I frankly do not understand and cannot justify. Effective today, you're back to housekeeping wages. And honestly, if you don't like it, the door is right over there." Dolores said nothing. She just nodded once and went back to work. The second thing to go was Bernard's private study. Camille had it gutted within a week. The bookshelves were torn out. The Persian rug was rolled up and sold to a dealer in Manhattan for a fraction of its worth. Bernard's collection of first edition automotive books, the same books he had loaned to Dolores one at a time over 6 years, was hauled to a donation center in Bridgeport. Dolores watched from the pantry as the movers carried the last box out the front door. Inside her apron pocket, she carried the folded piece of paper with the chassis number on it. The third thing Camille destroyed was harder to name. It was the atmosphere of the house itself. The quiet dignity Bernard had insisted on, the small kindnesses he had woven into daily life, the way he greeted every member of staff by name and remembered their children's birthdays. All of it vanished within a month. Camille replaced Bernard's longtime butler with a private security guard who patted down the housekeepers when they left at the end of each shift. She installed cameras in the staff break room. She changed the locks on every door in the mansion and issued new keys that had expiration dates coded into their magnetic strips. Dolores kept her head down. She scrubbed and dusted and polished. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and right away, ma'am. And every night when her shift ended and she drove her rattling Toyota back to her apartment, she opened her grandfather's notebook and read a few pages before bed, the way another woman might read a prayer book. She never went to look at the car. Not once. Not in the 3 months between the funeral and the party. She knew it was there. She knew where it was. But she also knew that if she was seen going near it, Camille would find some way to lock her out of the property entirely, and whatever Bernard had left her would be lost. So she waited. The party was Camille's idea. She called it a celebration of transition. It was really a debutante ball for her own ego, an announcement to the Connecticut aristocracy that the Beaumont estate was now hers, and that the old man's era of quiet philanthropy and cross-class civility was officially over. She invited 300 people, champagne fountains, a 12-piece orchestra, uniformed servers with white gloves. Dolores was not one of the servers. Camille had specifically kept her assigned to interior housekeeping that afternoon, cleaning bathrooms while 300 guests trampled marble floors in $5,000 shoes. But then, around 3 in the afternoon, Camille had an idea. She'd been drinking champagne since 11 that morning. She was flushed and loud and holding court on the South Terrace, entertaining a cluster of her wealthy friends with stories about her father's eccentricities. Someone, a hedge fund wife with too much filler in her lips, mentioned that Bernard had reportedly left sentimental gifts to certain longtime employees. Camille laughed, loud and sharp. "Oh, you have no idea. Do you want to see the most pathetic gift ever bequeathed? Do you? Come with me, everyone. Everyone come with me. This is going to be hilarious." She led a procession of guests around the side of the mansion, past the carriage house, and to the small outbuilding at the rear of the property. A gardener had already been instructed that morning to pull the tarp off the vehicle inside and roll it out onto the gravel. The car sat in the afternoon sun, red with rust, filthy with 3 decades of dust and bird droppings, its tires flat, its windshield cracked, one headlight dangling from a single wire like a plucked eye. Camille clapped her hands together with delight. "Someone bring me Dolores right now. I want everyone to see this." A security guard was dispatched. Dolores was pulled from a second-floor bathroom, still holding a bottle of glass cleaner, and marched down the servants' staircase and out onto the gravel driveway where 300 people had now gathered in a rough semicircle around the rusted car and the smirking heiress. "Dolores, darling, come here. Come stand next to me." Camille's voice was performing for the crowd now, pitched high and theatrical. "So, as many of you know, my father, may he rest in peace, had a soft spot for certain members of his household. He liked to think of himself as a philanthropist, a benefactor of the working class, and in his will he left this to Dolores." She gestured grandly at the wreck. "Isn't it magnificent?" The laughter started slow, uncertain, then built as the guests realized they were expected to laugh. It swelled into a wave. Dolores stood beside the car, glass cleaner still in her hand, and did not move. "Now I could have just had it hauled to the scrapyard," Camille continued. "It's worth exactly nothing. The tow truck would probably charge me more than the salvage value. But that felt cruel, don't you think? Robbing this dear woman of her inheritance. So in the spirit of honoring my father's wishes, and because I am nothing if not generous, I present to you, Dolores Whittaker, your brand new automobile." She reached into her clutch, pulled out the rusty key and flung it. The key arced through the sunlight, catching the afternoon glare, and landed with a metallic clatter at Dolores's feet. The laughter rose again. Someone, a man in a linen blazer, actually applauded. "Take the trash, sweetheart," Camille called out, raising her champagne flute. "It's all yours." Dolores did not bend down immediately. She stood very still, and for a long moment the only sound was the distant hum of the orchestra playing something by Vivaldi on the front terrace, and the ripple of laughter dying down as the crowd began to sense, without quite knowing why, that something was not going according to Camille's script. Dolores was not crying. She was not shaking. She was not looking at the ground. She was looking at the car. Her eyes had traced the roofline. They had followed the curve of the front fender, the shape of the grille opening, the angle of the windscreen, the placement of the door handles. Her eyes had moved to the hood, where beneath decades of grime and oxidation, a faint scalloped shape suggested a specific style of louvers used by exactly one European coach builder in exactly one production run between 1959 and 1961. Her eyes had moved to the wheels, and even flat and cracked, she recognized the spoke pattern of a set of Borani rims that had been custom-ordered for a very specific type of vehicle. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She bent down slowly, picked up the key, and closed her fingers around it. Then she straightened, looked directly at Camille, and said in a voice so quiet that only the people in the front row could hear her, "Thank you, Miss Beaumont." Camille blinked. She had expected tears, or begging, or at minimum humiliated silence. She had not expected a thank you. "Well," she said, recovering quickly and turning back to her audience, "you're absolutely welcome. Now please get it off my property by sundown. I don't want that eyesore ruining my driveway a minute longer than necessary." Dolores nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the servants' entrance to change out of her uniform for the last time. The crowd began to disperse, some still chuckling, others drifting back toward the champagne. Camille lingered by the car for a moment, took out her phone, snapped a picture of the rusted heap for her Instagram story, added a laughing emoji, and captioned it, "When Daddy leaves the maid his prized possession lol. Some people really do get what they deserve." She posted it and thought nothing more of it. Dolores changed out of her uniform in the small locker room off the kitchen. She folded the gray dress carefully, placed it on the bench, and set her name tag on top of it. Then she pulled on the jeans and sweatshirt she had worn that morning, slung her canvas tote over her shoulder, and walked out of the Beaumont estate for the last time. She did not go back for the car. Not yet. She needed help, and she needed a plan, and she needed a place to put it. She drove straight to Marcus's salvage yard. Marcus was 59, a retired long-haul trucker who had opened the yard with the money he'd saved over 4 decades on the road. He was Dolores's late husband's cousin, and he was the closest thing to family she had left in the state of Connecticut. She sat down across from him in his cluttered office, and she told him everything. About Bernard, about the notebook, about the folded piece of paper with the chassis number, about what she had seen in that rusted heap sitting on the Beaumont gravel. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dolores, if you are right about this, and I mean if you are really right, then we cannot let anyone know until we can prove it. You understand me? Not one word to anyone, not your sister, not your church friends, nobody. I know. I've got a warehouse out in Danbury. Old textile mill I bought last year thinking I'd flip it. It's got power, it's got a bay door, and it's got nobody watching it. I can have a flatbed at the Beaumont gate by 10 tonight." She said sundown. "Then we'll be there by 6. They were there by 5:45. Marcus drove the flatbed himself. Dolores rode in the passenger seat with her grandfather's notebook clutched in her lap. When they pulled up to the estate gate, the same security guard from that morning waved them through without a second glance. The car was still sitting on the gravel where the gardener had left it. Camille had already gone inside to nurse a hangover. They winched it onto the flatbed in 23 minutes, threw a tarp over it, strapped it down, and drove away into the deepening dusk. The Danbury warehouse smelled of old cotton dust and machine oil. Marcus had left a single row of fluorescent lights burning above the main bay, and when they backed the flatbed inside and rolled down the corrugated steel door behind them, the silence that settled over the space felt almost sacred. Dolores stood beside the passenger door of the truck and stared at the rusted shape on the flatbed for a long time before she spoke. "I need to see the chassis plate." Marcus nodded. He set up two portable work lamps on tripods, unwound an extension cord, and flooded the underside of the vehicle with bright white light. Dolores crawled underneath on her back, the way her grandfather had taught her, using a mechanic's creeper Marcus kept for salvage inspections. She held a flashlight between her teeth and a soft bristled brush in her right hand. Then, working with the delicacy of a jeweler cleaning an antique watch, she began to sweep away the layers of caked mud and corrosion from the frame rail near the front suspension. It took her 40 minutes. When she finally saw the stamped numbers, she stopped breathing. She had been carrying Bernard's folded piece of paper in her pocket for 3 months. She pulled it out now, with hands that were suddenly steady, and she compared the number written in Bernard's shaky script with the number stamped into the steel above her face. They matched. Every digit, every letter, every hyphen. She let out a sound that was neither a laugh nor a sob, but something in between, something that had been locked inside her chest for 22 years, and Marcus, waiting outside the wheel well, heard it and knew without asking what it meant. Dolores rolled out from under the car, sat up on the creeper, and wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. Marcus offered her a hand and pulled her to her feet. "Talk to me, Dolores. What is it?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened her grandfather's notebook, flipped past pages of pencil sketches and factory formulas and hand-copied production records, and stopped on a page near the middle of the book. She turned it around and held it up for Marcus to see. The page was headed with a single line in Elijah Whittaker's careful handwriting. Ferrari 250 GT SWB California Spider, competition specification, aluminum body by Scaglietti. Only 56 built. 9 were competition spec alloy. Of those 9, 3 are missing from all known registries as of 1988. Beneath that was a sketch, and beneath the sketch, a list of chassis numbers. The number on the flatbed matched the second entry on the list. Marcus sat down heavily on a wooden crate. Dolores, how much is that worth?" She closed the notebook. Her voice was very quiet. "The last one that came to auction, and it was not the competition alloy body. It was the standard steel body, and it did not have the racing provenance, sold for $18 million in 2016. This one, if it is what my grandfather said it is, and if the paperwork can be traced, this one is worth at least 40, maybe more." Marcus stared at her. Then he stared at the rusted heap on the flatbed. Then he stared back at her. "Dolores, I know. Dolores, we need to be very, very careful. I know, Marcus, I know." She looked at the car again, and she thought about Bernard lying in his hospital bed with morphine dulling his eyes, pressing that folded piece of paper into her hand. "You'll know what to do." He had known. He had known the whole time. He had bought this car in Marseille in 1979, when a private French collector's estate had liquidated after the man's death, and Bernard had recognized what nobody else at that sale had recognized, and he had paid what would have been considered a fortune at the time, but was in fact one of the greatest bargains in the history of the automotive market. And then he had hidden it. For 44 years. He had hidden it from his wives, from his daughter, from his insurance company, from the tax authorities, from the entire world. And in the end, he had given it to the one person in his life he trusted to understand what it was and to know what to do with it. Dolores sat down on the crate next to Marcus. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon fluttered. "Marcus," she finally said, "I am going to need help. I cannot restore this car alone. I need to bring in people, quiet people, people who understand what silence is worth." Marcus nodded. He knew exactly who to call. The first person Marcus called was a man named Theodore Grissom. Theodore was 71, a retired body man who had spent 43 years at a specialty restoration shop in Greenwich that catered exclusively to the East Coast collector circuit. He had personally restored 2 Bugatti Type 57s, a Talbot Lago T26, and one of the surviving Ferrari 250 GTOs before his hands gave out from arthritis. He now lived alone in a small house in Ridgefield and spent his days building scale models on his kitchen table. He owed Marcus a favor that went back to 1994 and involved a Cadillac and a woman whose name neither of them ever spoke aloud. Marcus called him at 8 the next morning. Theodore listened for 90 seconds. Then he said, "I will be there in 2 hours. Do not touch anything until I get there." He arrived in a rusted Ford pickup with a leather tool roll on the passenger seat. He walked into the warehouse, stopped 10 feet from the car, and stood there for what felt like a very long time. Then he removed his cap, held it against his chest, and said, "Well, I'll be damned." He turned to Dolores. "You know what this is?" "Yes, sir, I do." "How?" She opened her grandfather's notebook. Theodore read the page, then read it again, then closed the book carefully and handed it back to her. "Whittaker and Sons, Charleston, your grandfather." "Yes, sir. I met Elijah Whittaker once, in 1979, at a concours in Amelia Island. He was consulting on the restoration of a Delahaye. He told me my paint work on a Jaguar XK 120 was, and I quote, competent but lazy. Made me redo the whole passenger door before he'd shake my hand." Theodore smiled faintly. "Best lesson I ever got." Dolores smiled for the first time in a long time. "Ma'am," Theodore said, "if you'll have me, I would be honored to work on this vehicle. I won't take a dime, not one. Just let me put my hands on it before I die." The second person Marcus called was a woman named Priscilla Chen. Priscilla was 42, a metallurgist who had left a corporate materials science job to run a small private laboratory in Waterbury that did authentication work for museums and auction houses. She was known in the industry as the person you called when a chassis stamp was in dispute or a paint sample needed to be dated with scientific certainty. She charged $800 an hour and had a 6-month waiting list. Marcus did not have $800 an hour, but Priscilla owed Dolores a debt that Dolores herself had almost forgotten. 12 years earlier, Priscilla's mother had suffered a stroke and had been sent home from a Greenwich hospital with a home health aide who could not speak the family's language and who had not been trained to handle the specific complications of the case. Dolores, who had known the family through her church, had spent every one of her days off for 4 straight months sitting with Priscilla's mother, translating, feeding her, keeping her clean, keeping her comfortable until she died peacefully in her own bed. Priscilla had tried to pay Dolores. Dolores had refused. When Priscilla answered her phone and heard Marcus explain the situation, she said, "I will clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks. Tell Dolores I am coming today." The third person was a lawyer. Her name was Yolanda Freeman. She was 58, a Yale law graduate who had walked away from a partnership track at a white-shoe Manhattan firm in her mid-30s to open a solo practice in New Haven representing domestic workers, home health aides, and low-wage service employees in wrongful termination and wage theft cases. She had a shelf full of pro bono awards and a reputation for being the single most terrifying cross-examiner in the state of Connecticut. Dolores had met her twice at community events at her church. Dolores drove to New Haven the following afternoon. She sat in Yolanda's office for 3 hours and told her the entire story. When she finished, Yolanda closed her legal pad, took off her glasses, and said, "Dolores, I am going to ask you a series of questions. I need you to answer them honestly." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you have any documentation that Bernard Beaumont left this vehicle to you?" "I have a folded piece of paper in his handwriting with the chassis number on it." "Anything witnessed? Anything notarized?" "No, ma'am." "Do you have any witnesses to Camille Beaumont giving you the vehicle in front of the party guests?" Dolores paused. Then she smiled. "About 300 of them, and she posted it on Instagram." Yolanda leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a long time. Then she began, very slowly, to smile. "Dolores," Yolanda said, "I want you to understand what Camille Beaumont did on that terrace from a purely legal perspective. She stood in front of 300 witnesses. She made a public declaration of gift. She physically transferred the key. She posted photographic evidence to a public social media account with a caption acknowledging the transfer. In the eyes of Connecticut civil law, that is what we call a completed inter vivos gift. It is done. It is final. It cannot be revoked simply because the donor discovers that the gifted property was more valuable than she believed." She paused. "However, when Camille finds out what that car is, and she will find out, she is going to fight." She is going to hire the most expensive lawyers in New York, and she is going to argue mutual mistake, fraud, undue influence, and probably 3 other theories I have not thought of yet. She is going to try to bury you in paper. She is going to leak stories to the press about you being a thief. She is going to make your life a nightmare for as long as it takes to break you. Dolores nodded slowly. What do? We move faster than she can. We get the car authenticated. We get the paperwork airtight. We file a preemptive declaratory judgment action to establish clear title before she even knows what she lost. And we build a media strategy that puts her Instagram post in front of every journalist in the country the moment she starts fighting back. Dolores was quiet for a moment. I do not want a media circus, Yolanda. I do not want to be famous. I just want what Bernard gave me. I understand. But Camille is going to force the story into the open one way or another. Our only choice is whether we shape it or she does. Yolanda leaned forward. Dolores, listen to me. There are women all over this country working 2 jobs, getting talked down to, being called sweetheart by their bosses, being invisible in the houses they clean. If your story gets out, and it will, it is going to mean something to a lot of people. You do not owe anyone your pain. But you might want to think about what it would mean to let them see the ending. Dolores looked out the window of the office for a long time. She was thinking about her grandfather, about the tobacco barn on the Ashley River, about the day the wrecking ball came and Elijah stood on the sidewalk and cried without moving his face, about all the small humiliations she had swallowed for 22 years in a house where a girl young enough to be her granddaughter called her sweetheart in the same tone she used with her poodle. All right, she said finally. Let's do it right. The restoration began the following Monday. Theodore Grissom moved into a small apartment above the warehouse that Marcus set up with a cot, a hot plate, and a coffee maker. Priscilla Chen drove up from Waterbury 3 days a week with her testing equipment in the back of her Subaru. Marcus took over the security detail personally, sleeping in the warehouse office most nights with a shotgun leaned against his desk, and a Rottweiler named Preacher curled up on the concrete floor beside him. Dolores worked 12-hour days. She had never been happier in her life. She wore coveralls that had belonged to her grandfather, patched at the elbows and worn soft as flannel. She tied a bandana over her hair. Her hands, which had spent 2 decades wringing out mop water and folding hotel corners, now held calipers and torque wrenches and single-hair paintbrushes. Theodore watched her work for the first 3 days without saying a word. Then, on the 4th day, he said quietly to Marcus in the office, "That woman was born to do this. It is a crime against nature that anyone ever handed her a broom." Priscilla's initial tests came back within a week. The chassis stamp was authentic. The alloy composition of the body panels matched Scaglietti factory specifications for the 1961 competition run. Trace paint samples pulled from beneath the accumulated rust and grime matched Rosso Sena, the exact factory shade that Ferrari had used on the alloy-bodied competition Californias. The engine block, when they finally accessed it, carried a matching number stamp that placed it as original to the chassis, an almost unheard-of survival for a car that had been off the grid for 4 decades. By the end of the 2nd week, they had confirmed what Dolores had suspected the moment she saw the car on the Beaumont gravel. It was one of the 3 missing competition alloy 250 GT SWB California Spiders. Bernard Beaumont had found it in 1979, had recognized it, had paid $22,000 for it in cash to a widow in Marseille who had no idea what her late husband had been sitting on, and had hidden it in his own outbuilding for 44 years, waiting for the right person to come along. The restoration took 9 months. Theodore did the bodywork himself, panel by panel, hammering out 4 decades of dents and dings using techniques his own mentor had learned from a Modenese craftsman in the 1950s. Dolores did the mechanical work, disassembling the engine on a clean tarp spread across the warehouse floor, cleaning each component by hand under a magnifying lamp, replacing only what could not be saved, and preserving every original part that could be. Priscilla ran tests. Marcus kept watch. Yolanda quietly filed paperwork in 3 states. The car came back to life on a Tuesday in early September. Dolores turned the key at 9 in the morning, and the engine, silent for 44 years, caught on the third crank and settled into a deep, steady idle that filled the warehouse with a sound like distant thunder. Theodore Grissom, who had not cried since his wife's funeral in 2011, stood in the corner of the bay and wept openly. Marcus put his arm around Dolores's shoulder. Priscilla took photographs. Dolores sat behind the wheel with her hands resting on the polished wood, and she thought about her grandfather. She thought about the folded piece of paper in Bernard's shaky handwriting. She thought about the rusty key that had clattered at her feet on the Beaumont gravel while 300 people laughed. And for the first time since Bernard's funeral, she allowed herself to smile without hiding it behind a hand or a bowed head. Yolanda broke the news to the world on a Thursday morning in October. She did it strategically, releasing the story simultaneously to 3 major outlets. A Wall Street Journal reporter got the financial angle. A New York Times reporter got the human interest angle. A Haggerty magazine writer got the automotive angle. Each of them had been given a 4-hour head start on the general press pool, and each of them had been given access to Priscilla's authentication documents, Theodore's restoration logs, and Yolanda's legal filings. The story broke at 10 in the morning. By noon, it was the most read piece on all 3 publications' websites. By 3 in the afternoon, it had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. By 6, it was leading international broadcasts. Housekeeper inherits rusted junk car from late employer, discovers it is worth $40 million. Heiress publicly humiliates domestic worker in viral Instagram post, then discovers she just gave away a Ferrari. 22 years of silence. How Dolores Whitaker recognized what no one else could see. Camille Beaumont found out from her personal assistant, who had seen the Wall Street Journal alert on her phone while getting coffee. Camille was in her father's old study, on a conference call with her financial advisor, when the assistant walked in without knocking and held out the phone with a trembling hand. Camille read the headline. Then she read it again. Then she stood up so quickly her chair toppled backward and she screamed. Not a scream of anger, a scream of pure animal recognition, the sound a person makes when they realize in a single instant that they have destroyed themselves. Her Instagram post from the day of the party was still up. It had been shared by that point more than 2 million times. The laughing emoji, the caption, "Some people really do get what they deserve." Her lawyers called within the hour. She fired them by lunchtime and hired new ones from a bigger firm in Manhattan. Those lawyers filed suit against Dolores Whitaker in Connecticut Superior Court by end of business, claiming fraud, mutual mistake, and undue influence. They asked the court to void the transfer and return the vehicle to the Beaumont estate. Yolanda Freeman had been waiting for exactly this. She had a response filed within 72 hours, along with a countersuit for defamation, wrongful termination, wage theft covering the 50% salary cut Camille had imposed 3 months earlier, and infliction of emotional distress. Attached to the countersuit as exhibits were screenshots of Camille's Instagram post, a video of the terrorist incident taken by one of the party guests and posted to TikTok, and sworn affidavits from 4 members of the Beaumont household staff describing the pattern of humiliation Camille had subjected Dolores to over the preceding 6 months. The court date was set for December. In the meantime, the story would not stop growing. Dolores had refused every interview request for the first 2 weeks. But when a young reporter from a public radio station in Hartford wrote her a handwritten letter, delivered by hand to Marcus's salvage yard, describing her own grandmother who had worked as a hotel maid for 30 years, Dolores agreed to sit down for one conversation. The interview aired on a Sunday morning. It was picked up by NPR the following day. Within a week, it had been listened to nearly 4 million times. The court hearing was held 2 weeks before Christmas. The courtroom was standing room only, reporters in the back rows, sketch artists in the front. Camille arrived in a black wool coat and dark glasses, flanked by 4 lawyers from her Manhattan firm. Dolores arrived in the same navy dress she wore to church, carrying her grandfather's notebook in her canvas tote bag, accompanied only by Yolanda Freeman and Marcus. Camille's lead attorney spoke first. He was polished and articulate, and he spent 45 minutes constructing an elaborate legal theory involving the doctrine of mutual mistake, the fiduciary obligations of household employees, and the notion that Bernard Beaumont had been in a state of diminished capacity in the final weeks of his life. He argued that Dolores had exploited her privileged access to the family patriarch to manipulate him into concealing an asset from the rightful heirs of the estate. He asked the court to void the transfer and impose sanctions. Yolanda Freeman stood up when he was finished. She did not speak for a long moment. She simply looked at the judge. Then she said, "Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence a single video. It is 38 seconds long. It was posted publicly by the plaintiff on her Instagram account on the day in question. I would ask the court to view it before I say anything further." The video was projected onto a screen mounted on the courtroom wall. 300 guests, a rusted car on gravel, Camille Beaumont in a cream-colored blazer laughing, tossing a key. "Take the trash, sweetheart. It's all yours." Laughter, applause. A hedge fund wife wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. When the video ended, the courtroom was silent. Yolanda let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds before she spoke. "Your Honor, my opposing counsel has spent 45 minutes constructing a theory of mutual mistake, but there was no mistake made on the day of the transfer. Miss Beaumont was not mistaken about what she was doing. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was performing an act of public cruelty for the entertainment of her guests. She was humiliating a black woman who had served her family for 22 years. She was making a gift, and she was making sure that everyone she knew watched her make it, because the pleasure she derived from the gift was inseparable from the audience she performed it for. The only thing Miss Beaumont was mistaken about was the identity of the person she was mocking. She thought she was mocking a maid. She was in fact mocking a woman who had forgotten more about classic automobiles than her father's entire collection of consultants and appraisers had ever known. Yolanda paused. "Your Honor, the law is very clear. A completed gift made in public with contemporaneous documentation cannot be revoked because the donor later regrets the value of what she gave. To rule otherwise would be to say that cruelty is protected in this country, so long as it is not too expensive. My client asks this court to affirm what 300 witnesses, 1 Instagram post, 1 TikTok video, and 40 million viewers already know. The car is hers. It was hers from the moment that key hit the gravel." The judge ruled from the bench. "It took her 4 minutes. The gift was valid. The transfer was final. The countersuit for wage theft would proceed to trial in the spring. Camille Beaumont was ordered to pay Dolores Whittaker's legal fees." Camille walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Within 6 months, she would be quietly forced out of the board of Beaumont Industrial Holdings by the surviving trustees of her father's estate, who had watched her behavior over the preceding year with growing alarm, and who had finally decided that Bernard's legacy would not survive her stewardship. She would sell the Greenwich mansion within the year and move to a smaller property in Palm Beach, where she would attempt to rebuild her social standing and largely fail. Dolores Whittaker sold the Ferrari at auction the following March. The final hammer price, after a bidding war between a collector in Monaco and a museum in Japan, was $47 million. She did not buy a mansion. She did not buy a yacht. She bought a modest house in New Haven, 3 bedrooms, a small garden with a detached garage in the back. She used the rest to open the Elijah Whittaker Restoration School, a tuition-free vocational program for young people from working-class backgrounds who wanted to learn the trade her grandfather had spent his life mastering. Theodore Grissom was her first hire. Priscilla Chen taught a metallurgy course 2 Saturdays a month. The sign above the school's front door was hand-painted, the same way Elijah had painted the sign above his workshop on the Ashley River in 1938. Everything has a story underneath if you're patient enough to scrape off the dirt. If this story moved you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it today. And if you have ever been the person nobody noticed, the person nobody thought was capable, remember Dolores Whittaker. Remember that the world is full of quiet people carrying knowledge that could change everything. And remember that the last laugh, when it comes, is worth every second of the silence that came before it. Subscribe, hit the bell. More stories are coming. Peace.